Whenever I recommend using Quinacridone Magenta for mixing purple instead of red, people say I'm using the wrong shade of red. So let's test that out. Let's mix purple from these reds and we'll compare it to Dioxazine Purple, which is probably one of the more vibrant purples you can buy. And I'll compare it to the purple that you can mix from Quinacridone Magenta. This is Dioxazine Purple and we'll use that as a reference. I'll add some white to it to lighten it up because it's really dark right from the tube. So that makes a rather vibrant purple. I'll add more white to it so we can get a better idea of what this purple looks like. Let's see how close we can get to that Dioxazine Purple by mixing magenta with Ultramarine Blue. This is Quinacridone Magenta and Ultramarine Blue. You have to fiddle with the balance between the Ultramarine Blue and the magenta in order to get that to look like Dioxazine Purple. I'll add a little bit of titanium white to lighten it up a bit. This seems to have more magenta in there. I can add a little bit of ultramarine blue in there to make it more purple. It's pretty close to the Dioxazine Purple, and I can add more white to it just to see what the pastel version of it is. So that works pretty good. You can use that as a substitute for Dioxazine Purple. Next, I'll mix purple using different reds, and we'll see how that compares to these two purples. So I'll start off with Cadmium Red Medium. I'll be using Ultramarine Blue to mix all these purples, and that's because it's more biased towards purple than the phthalo blue. So if you add a little bit of blue to it, it starts to go brownish. You can add more blue to it, and it does start to take on somewhat of a purplish color, but you can see it's not nearly as vibrant as the Dioxazine Purple or the magenta. So add more white in there, and you can see that's not nearly as vibrant as any of the other purples I mixed. I can add more white in there. I could try adding more red. It doesn't matter how much red or blue I put in here, it looks pretty dull compared to these other two samples. This is Naphthol Red Light. It's pretty much the same result. A little bit turns it brown. And if I add more blue in there, it does kind of go purple, but it's not very vibrant. I'll add some white to it. And that doesn't look like either of these. It looks kind of grayish compared to these two purples. This is Pyrrole Red. It's one of my favorite reds. I like it more than Cadmium Red. And I do think it's a bit more red and more saturated than these two. But it still doesn't help. I'll add a little bit of blue to this and it turns kind of like a purplish brown. I often use this as a shortcut, Pyrrole Red and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and that gives you a pretty decent brown. Here's a good example where I use Pyrrole Red and ultramarine blue to match the color of this chocolate. This is from a previous video about color matching brown foods. There's a link to it in the description below. But if you add more blue to it, it doesn't really get that much more purple. And again, I'll add a little bit of white to it so we can see it better. And it doesn't have that vibrant look that these two have. My white paint is getting contaminated, so I'll squeeze out a little bit more. That is purplish, but it's much more desaturated than these two. This is the Cadmium Red Light that I used before, and it looked kind of orangish because of technical problems I was having. This is Cadmium Orange, and this is Cadmium Red Light. I think we know the drill here. This is not really going to make purple, is it? I'll add a little bit more blue in there. It still looks kind of brownish. Lighten it up. And that doesn't look nearly as saturated as these two purples. This is Alizarin Crimson hue. This kind of makes a reddish purple. Let's lighten it up a bit. It's still not very vibrant. These look more vibrant to me than what I'm getting here. And you could try to adjust this a bit more. Here's more blue. And if I add more alizarin in there, like this darker version doesn't look like this vibrant purple over here. This is crimson. I'm not quite sure what pigment is in here. I'll start with this crimson add a little bit of the Ultramarine Blue into it. This really doesn't work either. We'll lighten that up a little bit. That's still desaturated compared to these two purples. I could try adding more blue in there. Alright, so why is this? And I can demonstrate why I think it works this way. In other videos, I've demonstrated how to mix red from Quinacridone Magenta and a transparent yellow. If you can mix a color, it's not a primary color, so I'll show you how you can mix red right now. This is benzalmidazoline yellow, and you can tell from this paint swatch up here that it's rather transparent. It doesn't cover those black stripes at all. I'll start with the magenta and add some yellow into it. And it starts to turn reddish compared to what we started out with. This is actually easier to see if I brush it out onto the paper. It's not too far off from some of these reds. Maybe a little more yellow. I mean, that's pretty close to that red. What was that? Cadmium Red Medium, I think? It's not that far off. So let's think about this. If red is a mixture of the yellow and magenta, what happens when I mix this with the blue? It's going to end up like these colors. And that's because there's yellow in there. So my thought is just leave out this yellow, and that's what we got up here. It's just magenta and the blue. So if I just mix this up so it's uniform and take some of this ultramarine blue, what do we get? So what is the result? It's desaturated just like the rest of these, and that's because there's yellow in there. I could try adding white to it, and it looks pretty grayish. I could try adding more blue to that, and that doesn't really help out that much. So what's the conclusion? If you want the most vibrant purple, use dioxazine. Otherwise, you can mix it from Quinacridone Magenta. Every red that I tried ended up with like a dull purple color. Some of them even look kind of grayish. And the reason for that is because red is basically, in theory, a combination of yellow and magenta. And it's that yellow that makes it dull. But if you leave that yellow out and just use magenta by itself, this is what you get. I hope that makes sense. If you have any thoughts on this, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you're interested in learning more about color mixing, I have a course where I demonstrate the basics of color theory. I do demonstrations using both student and professional acrylics, and I cover all of the tools and colors that I use. I do a demonstration on how to mix black and grays from primary colors. I also discuss how neutral colors you find in nature often have color in it. And that's why I mix black and grays from colors instead of from black. In another section, I demonstrate how you can compensate for how acrylics dry darker. There's a link to the course in the description below. Thanks for watching.